Now let's study about the methods of measuring the measures of dispersion. And as we learnt in the previous clipping that there are two methods of measuring dispersion, which are the absolute measure and the relative measure. In the absolute measure, we take the unit as it is, but in the relative measure, we take it in relative form, say could be in percentage. As far as the methods are concerned of the absolute measure of measuring dispersion, they are range, quartile, mean deviation, standard deviation and the Lorentz curve. But when we talk of measuring it in relative terms, then it is coefficient of range, coefficient of quartile deviation, coefficient of mean deviation, coefficient of standard deviation. Now this means that whenever we find out the measure of dispersion, that is we measure it, that is the time we need to find out in both these terms, both in absolute measure and the relative measure. So the first method that we must know in measuring the measures of dispersion is the range. Range is in fact when we find out the difference between the highest value and the lowest value in a series. That gives us the range. That is simple range of the absolute measure. Now the formula will be, as I said, highest value minus lowest value. Now I have taken up a series, say 20, 30, 40, 50 and 100. When I pick up this series and I want to find out the range of this series, what I am going to do is I am going to find out which is the highest and which is the lowest range or which is the lowest unit in the series, and that is 100 is the highest value and 20 is the lowest value. So the range will be 100 minus 20 giving me 80. 80 is the range of the series comprising of 20, 30, 40, 50 and 100 observation. But when I have to find out the relative measure, that is the coefficient of the range, what I am going to do is I am going to apply the formula which says highest minus lowest value upon highest plus lowest value. We already know the highest and the lowest value 120, which means 100 minus 20 upon 100 plus 20, which will give me 80 upon 120 and giving me 0.67 as the coefficient of range. So first of all, we have learnt in this clipping that there are 5 methods of the measures of absolute measure of dispersion, and when we find out these in the relative term, they become coefficient, whether it is coefficient of range, coefficient of quartile deviation, coefficient of mean deviation, of standard deviation, and of course Lorentz curve is there only in the absolute measure of dispersion. In the next clipping, we are going to learn about the second method of measuring the measures of dispersion, which is called as the quartile deviation.